Well, it's Africa Day, and it goes beyond dressing African, talking African, and expressing yourself in African. There's something about the continent that a whole lot of people haven't actually been able to unearth. Over 1.3 billion people. And of course, this is the second largest continent in the world. That's our focus today on Village Square Africa. And I'm going to be having this fantastic conversation with experts on African affairs. Welcome, I'm Sulai. You know, one of those fantastic moments in the life of a journalist. I've been asking myself how best to really come, and express what makes you an African. Is it in the dressing or that dress made by an African, whether it is on the imprint of a European. But these are some of the key things, some experts would want to discuss. But again, on May 25, 1963, leaders from 30 of the then 32 independent African countries came together to form the Organization of African Unity, now AU. OAU was established to ensure more African countries become independent, free, and more productive, while the OAU has since metamorphosed into the African Union with more member nations. A true African unity is still in the works, with deep issues still existent. Every African nation has a beautiful culture to project, wonderful traditions to promote, and otherworldly scenery to show the world, but the continent also has cracks and persistent problems that threaten its existence as a true African unity. Now, a continent with 70% of its population in their youth can boast of a democratically elected youth president, but has septuagenarians and octogenarians clinging on to power. But for some other experts, that is immaterial. What is important on the continent is good governance. Well, while it's the year of arts, culture, and heritage, by every means, the true definitions of Africa, there's the need to preserve this culture through conscious actions and active citizen participation and engagement. I'm excited having two professors with me on the show today. Professor Ahmed Yerima, Professor of Theatre and Cultural Studies, Professor Macharia Munene, Professor of History and International Relations. Later on the show, we'll be having Taopheek Babayeju, an author, and of course, Tamunokuro, a writer and founder, Afrisankofa. Well, good to have you both. Let me attempt something with both of you. Professor Munene, let me say, maybe in Kiswahili, correct me when I go wrong, habari ya journey, Professor.
And Jema Sana, you've done very well.
Thank you very much. And to you, Professor Ahmed Yerima, Mohode, Professor.
Yes, I am.
I attempted Kiswahili with Professor Munene, and he said I did well. I'm trying to also do this with you. In your mother tongue, Mohode, Professor.
Mo Ogbo.
Ofuno. Well, I'm excited having both of you on the show today. Well, going by Africa's history, let me start with you, Professor Munene. When did Africa truly become a united people?
That's a hard one to say, but I think May 1963, the founding of the OAU, could be said to be a recognition of that reality that the peoples in Africa were one, as opposed to being peoples in different countries. Your question about when did that realization come into being, it was there before, but the actualization of that realization can be said to be the creation of the Organization of African Unity, in which there was a lot of hope and expectations that the oneness, the whole Pan-Africanist movement and idea from its 19th century inception as a struggle against imperialism racism and all types of anti-Black, anti-African policies that were common in most places in the West. And when the continent was turned into European property, because that's what colonization was all about, is turning different parts of Africa into the real estate of particular European countries. So Africans stopped being humans as long as the Europeans were concerned, because they were property of various Europeans. And in fact, it was Joseph Chamberlain who described then Kenya as real estate for the British Empire to do what it wanted, and that. So that in itself, the turning of the African peoples into property, and then the struggle to move out of being property into humans, and that's the decolonization effort, which went through some stages of first accepting the reality that the Africans had been conquered by some foreign powers, and then turning that conquest into a movement of liberation, intellectually, materially, and politically. In 1963, the OAU marked the virtual culmination of that continental struggle to get rid of that feeling of being property and become independent, truly independent as African people who can assert their authority, their presence, and their interest at the global arena. And it was accepted. It had an impact at that time. One of the things that came out was when President John F. Kennedy sent a message of goodwill to the founders of the OAU in Addis Ababa. One of the things that he was told by one of the leaders was that thank you very much, but clean up your house. That's connecting the interest of the African Americans in the United States who are being harassed, messed up, and all those kind of things, and linking that with the struggle for Africa for the continental liberation. So the belief, the Pan-Africanist belief that the African, wherever he or she was part of the same system. When the African leaders told Kennedy, please clean up your house and stop all those mistreatment of Black people, it showed that Africans were now taking interest and being felt even beyond their continent.
Okay, let me leave Nairobi, Kenya, where Professor Munene is, and come to Nigeria, to Professor Ahmed Yerima. There are key things that I picked from Professor Munene. He said the unity then. I will come back for him to expatiate and ask if that unity is absent. But again, take us through that process, Professor Yerima. The unity of the African continent is very key. And with the establishment of the OAU at that time, many thought that through arts and culture, younger Africans, as Professor Munene highlighted, irrespective of where they are in the world, can always have this affinity and link to the continent. Would you say the continent has done much of that in bringing home some of its sons and daughters who are far off from the continent?
Well, yes, to an extent. 1963 did mark technically the coming to oneness of Africa. But what the foreign countries that owned Africa for a while, divided Africa, and then brought it together, did was to entrench themselves within the socio-political and cultural consciousness of the Africans themselves. And so the major problem was, even though they were being given a form of freedom, we were still divided. Even within a country like my country, Nigeria, the cultural and ethnic pluralism itself was a problem. And so Africa started, in getting a freedom, we started a new problem of how to decolonize ourselves. But do not forget that while the whites were here, there was a process of hegemony, a cultural erosion, and a replacement of such cultural erosion with the Western form of culture. And whether we like it or not, this Western form of culture was a process of deconstructing the old ones and reconstructing in a new hybridized culture. So Africa was never going to be the same again, even if you established an African unity forum in which Africans were to express their oneness. And from there you would find ideas like people like Leopold Senghor coming with the issue of negritude, Aimé Césaire, Jean-Paul Sartre. All these ideas came up in trying to find a form of individualism, because that was what was eroded. Africans had to first find who they were. And you would find, and that was the whole process. And whether we like it or not, whether the process of the first nationalism, post-nationalism, then the period of military coups in Africa, everything had a thing to do, a negative thing to do with the erosion of the culture of Africans. And so what we had for a long time, and even today, especially in my country, is the rudiments of the old culture, the hybridized culture, which we don't really understand, because what we are now trying to do is to ape the Western culture, and the Western culture itself is dying. So we are left in a bubble. And I think that's the problem with Africa right now. Trying to find an originality which doesn't exist. And so whether you do the dances and the culture, we've so hybridized them that they have lost their mythical, cultural, mystical, essence. So Africa is still trying to find or refine, rediscover itself. And that's the process I think we are in right now.
You know, listening to you, Professor Yerima, I can almost hear Professor Munene. You were not here many weeks ago when I had Professor Munene on the show. We were talking about neocolonialism, and some of the things you just touched on were some of the submission Professor Munene took us through. And I'm coming back to you, Professor Munene. Listening to Ahmed Yerima, it would seem as if because he said that, well, Africa can never be the same again. How can, some of these cultural heritage, because I recall the last time we had a conversation, you did say the world has actually evolved to a system whereby we will have a people that will be living with some pockets of cultures sieved from every other part of the world, and Africa is not an exemption. But again, there are some key cultures, key issues, traditions that, stands Africa out. For instance, in Kenya, that is the more reason tourists, flock to your country. Tell us how Africa can actually, first of all, ensure that these things are well kept for future generations to come, and also shown to the world just the way they are, unadulterated.
Thank you. Yes, it is true that part of the creation of colonialism, or the colonial states, was to destroy African cultures as a policy. Once you destroy culture, you dehumanize and make people believe that they are not humans, they have nothing to add. And in fact, part of the struggle, decolonization, was cultural, because you had that feeling that you cannot accept everything that the master insisted, although the master succeeded in a lot of ways to destroy much of the African heritage. But not everything was destroyed, because there were those who were struggling to ensure that something remained, something African continued despite the environment. You had at one time one of the champions of struggle raising the question of whether one stopped being an African because he was a Christian, or he stopped being a Christian because he was an African. That dilemma. And even if you look at people like Senghor and his negritude, and even Jomo Kenyatta and Fitz Mount Kenya, well, you see that struggle of saying, yes, we accept some of the Western things, but there are those inherent African things that cannot and should not be destroyed. So what we have continuing since then is hybridization of everything, because culture is dynamic. It's not static. And there's no place in the world where culture is static, it's dynamic. And in that dynamism, you incorporate everything that you come across without completely destroying the essence of what it is to be an African. The essence of what it is to be an African, that identity, other than being born and raised and speaking African languages, there is something that is different in an African, different from what a European is, different from what an American is, or an Asian. And you can tell it when you meet these people, because there is something that does not resonate very well, because there is a lack somewhere. So what I'm saying is that the essence of Africanness, the identity, there was an attempt to destroy it completely, but did not succeed. And so we have now continuing struggle within Africa on what emphasis there should be, exactly what is core interest in the African, that identity, such that when you have an African thinking that he's more European than being an African, there is a problem there in the first place. So there is that need for more and more Africans, particularly the elite, to accept the reality that it's a continuing struggle. It is not a one-time off. And that continuing struggle, there always will be challenges. And some of those challenges come from within. They come from within because we have people in Africa who are more European than the Europeans in their minds, and sometimes in their behavior.
I'll come back to you, Professor Munene. Hold your thought there. I hope you don't lose it, because it's very important that we start talking about some of those key problems. You've raised something very important here, which I want Professor Ahmed Yerima to expatiate on. And you did say it goes beyond speaking the language or understanding the culture, that there's something in it, in those who are Africans, irrespective of where they found themselves. Professor Yerima, is it, if that's a belief you also share, is that why sometimes we see people who are supposed to be non-Africans saying they're chasing and tracing their roots back to Africa, because wherever they are, they still have this deep feeling that they are Africans? So they decide to make that trip and journey to the continent.
I didn't quite get most of what you said, but I agree totally with Professor Munene. I believe that there are two major problems. I know Prof is a bit more optimistic about the future of Africa. But the major problem is the privileged class do not want the original African to emerge. The more he embraces the white man's culture or the Western culture, he believes that it is better for him. He understands that. And he has also used religion, and whether we like it or not, religion plays a major role in decolonization because it was a weapon which the white man used. And it's a weapon which we Africans, both educated and non-educated, but who are believers, have also used to eradicate the Africanness of Africans. And so once we look at that predicament which the African finds itself, he now begins to understand why the future is a bit bleak, and I'm not as optimistic as Prof, because the people who would have continued the rudiments of the leftover cultures which we have are now in small number. And the challenges of modernity itself has reduced and continues to reduce the number. Because the rich do not want you to, the rich people, to get more. And therefore, and so are they, and they are the ones who have embraced either Islam or Christianity to a point in which they have used them to eradicate the notion of African unity or African. It's now a bourgeois unity. And I think that is what happens because culture is also a way of thinking, is also the root of social behavior. And therefore it becomes, and yes, I agree, sir, that it is not static, it is growing. And that is also the damage, because as long as it is not static and it's growing, and those who control power, leadership becomes the problem. Because as long as those who control power see the Africanness as a backwardness and also a point that would delay their embracing the Western culture, which to them is sweet and it's lucrative, then there is bound to be a reduction in the cultural progress of Africa. And I think that is my humble stand, despite the... Yes.
All right, Professor Munene, I'd like to quickly react, and let's now start winding down on this, looking at the way forward for Africa and Africans watching this program across the continent. What are those key things, especially younger Africans? Because Professor Yerima said something that experts and custodians of the culture are thinning out. And personally, when I check my list, of those who are experts in this field, honestly, it is appalling, other than, you can actually count them on your fingertips. Now, he said they're thinning out. Do you think that that's a problem? And if it is, how can we get, a recruitment process that will have more younger Africans fill up this space so that this conversation will be continued even when we're gone?
Thank you. I think one of the things that can be done is to emphasize my favorite subject, history, the African aspect of history, because the destruction of the African history was a destruction of the African culture, a destruction of the African personality and African values, and therefore the cultural aspect became a thing that was to be shunned. And part of the elite that were groomed at the time of independence to take over post-colonial African states had been groomed or inculcated in their minds that everything African was diabolical, unacceptable, primitive, and civilized. And to be civilized was to be like a white man and not to think for oneself. The inability or the reluctance to think for self might explain why even today we have some countries in Africa that outsource thinking in terms of advice on policy from where Europe or the Americas, and rather than rely on their own people. That's part of that package. You also hear in some countries, policymakers, maybe ministers for education, and other high-ranking people claiming openly that history is not important. And yet, the basis of that identity, that culture, is the history of those people. So when we need to go back to that beginning in order to help cultivate the self-value. And once the youth are taught, are exposed to that African history, culture, way of life, then they'll be able to uphold it when they grow up. When they take de-emphasize from baby school to the universities, that you have top policymakers, you have international organizations telling people that if you need it, we shall give you. You don't need it. Then you know people are lost. So we go back to the drawing board. And in my view, one way of starting this thing is to ensure that all children in African schools, from baby school to the universities, are exposed to the history of their place, of the regions of the African continent, as a going concern, as a perpetual subject, so that it is inculcated in their minds and they grow up knowing these things. They don't grow up knowing more about France and England and Spain and Brussels and the United States, which is what happens now, instead of growing up knowing more about their own countries. If we do that, we shall be making a big beginning towards ensuring the youth who value their own country. In fact, we have now a lot of frustrated youth because they were brought up wrongly in terms of education. And that wrongness was part of that deculturalization that colonialism put in place. And some of our leaders imbibed as if it was a gospel. Now we need to deconstruct that gospel, and then as a way forward, I'm sure that our youth will be the beneficiary, and then all cannot be lost. There will be a way forward with that as a starting point, not the only part.
Well, a fantastic one there from Professor Munene. Let's close with Professor Ahmed Yerima. He's brought this back to your area of expertise, education. How can Africa find a balance between its past, its culture, and the continuous advancement of the world? Professor Yerima.
First, I agree totally with Prof's observation. By going back to the history of our past and by writing it ourselves. I have a very good example. In the year 2000, I was commissioned by the federal government to write a millennium play for Nigeria. And I had always been disturbed from when I was born, and I was told that Nigeria did not fight for its independence. And so I started looking at the history of Nigeria, trying to find out if there was ever a time when we confronted the British people and asked for a form of independence, a form of freedom. And I found it in Sokoto, where Atahiru was the Sultan who ruled for 6 months and was chased out by the British into a place called Burumi. And he was killed in Burumi with 100 soldiers of his. And they were buried there in a mass grave. And so I wrote the play. But when there was that Arewa House history, the Northern History Conference, and so I took copies of the play and I distributed those copies to members freely at my own cost. And unfortunately for me, one of the white scholars, a professor, who wrote the history of Atahiru and whose book was one of the books I used for my research, was there. And in the morning he came to me and he said, "Liar, Atahiru didn't die the way you said he died. In your play, he died a hero." And I said, in your book, Atahiru died a useless hero, a useless warrior. He died shamefaced. How can I tell my children and those who are going to read that history that the way you, the white man, wrote it is how it happened? And he asked me, were you there? And I asked him, were you there? Were you even in the African continent when it happened? And I think that is the basic thing that I got from Paul. That the history of our people, yes, history must be brought back. In fact, the mendacity was, at a particular time in Nigeria, we canceled history. One, because the people there themselves, the leaders, were more concerned with the hustling of politics rather than the understanding of where they are coming from and how to plan the present and understand the present and plan for the future. And that's what history does for you. It gives you the essence of who you are and what you are, like Prof. rightly said. But as long as we continue to allow the books of Western masters to dictate the history of Africa, Africa will always have a problem, because they will continue the process of erosion, of eroding our what's it called, our past. Even in Christianity, you will find a statement like, all things of the past are darkness, and so light has come. And this is a problem in which one must begin to understand even the essence of belief. Most people are told do not go home because there are witches in the villages. There are witches in the cities. And whether we like it or not, witchcraft has been part of the society of the African consciousness. I am not saying it is totally good, but we cannot erode it out and erode our past just because we are afraid of who and what we are. So both the niceties and the bad elements of African society and African essence must be analyzed by the newly educated Africans, people like you and I. And we will now sit down and look at the new Africa. We must find a new Africa. The Africa of the past are totally gone. The poems of Jomo Kenyatta begin to have very, very little effect. The heroes of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, does not exist for the Igbos existing now, or the Yorubas, or the Hausa. Those themes now have to be reworked to have new meanings.
I think it's a fine place for us to leave it. Professor Ahmed Yerima and Professor Munene, I must thank both of you for making it easy to reach out to talk about things that concerns the continent. And I think you've been able to stretch it for us to the extent that my producers have just said to me that we'll have this conversation again. And I'll be excited to have you, give us your precious time when we reach out to you to talk more about the continent, talk more about Africa. As both of you highlighted, Africans and Africa must start writing its story, its history, and bring back, things that will help those younger Africans coming up to get into the future. Once again, many thanks for being such nice company, Professor Munene and Professor Yerima. When we come back, Taopheek and Tamunokuro will be joining me after the break to wrap up this conversation on Village Square Africa here as we mark Africa Day. the homogenization of Africa has been a contentious issue as its diversity, tagged one of the beauties of the continent, is also a challenge to uniting Africa. Africa has more than 3,000 tribes, with nations like Ghana, Nigeria, and Ethiopia home to hundreds of different tribes with different cultures, traditions, and languages. Now, ideas like the African Continental Free Trade Zones are to ensure African unity and preserve the oneness of Africa, but there are deeper cracks waiting to be mended. For many years, there have hardly been events hosting African cultures and traditions, no thanks to insecurity issues, some of which are deeply rooted in cultural marginalization, abandonment, and a feeling of being maligned by a leadership. I think the very last ever seen on the continent was Festac, and that's been like 7-7. But anyway, joining me now is Taopheek, Babayeju, an author and Chief Executive Officer of iCentre, Tamunokuro, Obietonbara, a writer and founder, Afrisankofa. Both of you, good to have you here on the show. We just had a conversation with two African professors, quite an insightful and rich conversation. Let me start with you, Taopheek. You know, Africa has rich cultures and traditions, but there is a gradual phasing out of these practices. As an author, what role has industrialization played in this?
Thank you very much, Suleiman, for having me. Industrialization has not in any way eroded our culture. As a matter of fact, I think for what it is, it should actually be a blessing. Culture and industry should actually go hand in hand. So if you travel to China, for example, no matter how industrialized we feel China is, there's still an element of their culture in their industries. I remember growing up in the 80s, and the best furniture makers in Nigeria are from Benin. And you can see the element of art in every furniture, in any artwork that you see. And, so much so that, when the British came to Nigeria, the first set of things that they need to take out of this place was our bronze, our arts. So it shows the superiority of our production. And I think we've not been very conscious about how we infuse art, culture, and our heritage into our production. So industrialization, for me, shouldn't be a limit or an hindrance to art and culture. We can see how much our music as and our art has taken over the world, taking the world by storm. And we need to be very conscious about how we infuse our culture into everything like the Chinese do. So for me, I think industrialization, not necessarily westernization, should be a plus for our culture.
I think, Taopheek, you just touched on one fantastic area. Let me say it again. You said if the cultural artifacts that the British, especially coming to Nigeria, were not of superior, copies, then they wouldn't have actually taken them or stolen, even if some of them are now being returned. Quite an instructive one there. Let me bring in Tamuno. Tamuno, listen to Taopheek. He's painted a great picture of how industrious and creative these Africans were and still are. So while there are beautiful cultures, there are also some others many people call for their abolishment. Now, so what's the best approach to treating such situations?
Thank you, Suleiman. Thank you once again for having me. Yes, I agree with what he said. If our cultures, if what they meant were not of superior value, they wouldn't have stolen. I saw something the other day where someone said that what was stolen from Benin alone in 1897, what was stolen during the punitive expedition in Benin alone was worth more than all the cultural relics of Europe at that time. So this just goes to show you how civilized our ancestors were. We had the largest single man-made structure in the history of the world in Benin. So when they came, they were marveled at the level of superiority that they saw. And of course, they had to steal. And today we have most of our cultural relics in archaeological vaults, hidden, locked away in Europe. And so you just can't help but laugh, because these are the same people that say that Africans were savages, Africans were running around naked, living on trees and all that. But we understand that if you want to colonize the people, if you want to subjugate the people, of course, you're not going to say the truth about them. You're going to lie. However, in mainland China, what we have failed to do as a people is that we have failed to incorporate our cultures in our system. We are neglecting the cultural aspect. Yes, industrialization and culture go hand in hand, but we are not promoting our cultures. We are not promoting our system. It's true, some of our cultural practices are not sustainable, and if you study African culture, you will understand that our systems they were not made to be static. They were made to evolve with time. Take, for instance, land inheritance. I think it's long overdue for the system that prevents women from inheriting land to still be in place. I think that such cultures should be abolished, because back when they brought up these systems in place, you would understand that, yes, women should not inherit lands, because back then marriage was more serious than the way we take marriage today. So if a woman is getting married to a man, automatically everything that belongs to the woman becomes her husband's property. And so if women were to inherit lands, it then means that a rival community can use marriage as a form of a disguise to take over, to take over some other community that they are not in good terms with. All they need to do is just to get married to the women in that community, and in the space of 1 to 2 generations, they will take over as many lands as possible. So, but now that's not a concern, because you can be from for instance, let's use Nigeria. You can be from the southern part of Nigeria, and you can own lands in the north. You can own lands everywhere. So that's no longer the concern today. So I think cultural practices that prevent women from inheriting lands, should be abolished. So
let me comment here. Sorry to cut you there. Just trying to see how much we can take before we wind down. Taopheek, I'm blessed having both of you here, looking at these key issues, knowing what roles both of you play on the continent. So let's take it down home and looking at the bigger perspective now, Taopheek. How can Africa preserve its culture? Because listening to Tamuno, I want to asking you, how can Africa preserve its culture, and at the same time making it the standpoint and the biggest market of the continent to the rest of the world?
So you cannot preserve your culture when you don't know your history. History is at the bedrock of culture. What the colonial masters have done to us over time is to try and rewrite our history for us. And I think we're also doing the same thing for ourselves by rewriting, by taking that narrative that has been given to us, falsely anyway. So to do that, to change, to do justice to the African continent, we need to understand, first of all, understand our history. You cannot discover a continent or a country that already existed. Okay, so we were told that Mungo Park discovered Niger, River Niger. That's a total lie. That's a blatant lie. Okay, so we need to understand our culture. We need to also teach history deliberately. And we have also done ourselves a lot of injustice by removing history from the curriculum of our schools. So we need to consciously know our history, know our pride as a people until we are proud of who we are. That is when we can now rewrite the history of Africa. Because listen, everything is about communication, is about documentation. When we're growing up, we're made to believe that the culture, the Black American culture, the hip hop culture was superior to our own culture. So a young man like me growing up, jettisoned the Orlando War music and the rest of them to go for American music. But right now, in the whole of Nigeria, you can actually listen to Nigerian music across Africa without listening to any foreign music, because we have come to understand that we have superior music. So we need to push the narrative of our superiority, okay, and take away our inferiority, which has been forced on us. All right? Then we also need to be proud of who we are. Look at what Wakanda, a single movie, did to the psyche of an average African, whether American or African American or African made African. It changed the narrative that a superhero can actually come from Africa. If we can celebrate the gods of the Greeks and somebody is telling us Shango is able, we need to check ourselves, okay? We need to understand how we got here. The Benin Kingdom, with all respect, is a reservoir, is a repository. The Ife Kingdom is a repository of culture. We need to start looking at this repository of culture and celebrating them, not only celebrating them, but telling their story positively. And we need to move from how the British or the colonial masters on the developed Africa to how to change the narrative to how Africans deliberately change Africa. Thank you.
Well, it is very key here. You raise a whole lot there to chew on the plate, especially talking about discoveries and how such a kind of history have been fed to the young African. You made mention of the mouth of the Niger, the River Niger, and a few other places. And some also have also said, well, if someone came all the way to stop the killing of twins, who stopped the killing of twins in Europe before the Renaissance? Tamuno, let's take this home as we wind down. Listening to Taopheek, some of the key things he highlighted has got to do with history, bringing back history. And thankful enough, the government of Nigeria has looked in that direction to bringing back history. What more do you expect of Africans watching us at the moment, irrespective of where they are on the continent or outside the continent? How can that African be a part of this new move to ensuring the development of the continent?
Thank you, Suleiman. You know, he mentioned Mungo Park, and I was happy that he did so. Now, just today, I was having a conversation with a friend, and I told my friend that what Africa needs urgently, it's not really infrastructural development. Infrastructure is good. We need good hospitals, we need good roads, we need electricity, and so on and so forth. But what we urgently need is a mental overhaul. A mental overhaul, because most of the things we believe as our history is actually false. If you ask an African about African history, they would tell you about Mungo Park, which is a lie. They will tell you about Mary Celeste stopping the killings of twins, which is another monumental lie. Mary Celeste did not stop the killings of twins. It's a lie, and I can prove it to you that it's a lie. I took months to research and to make my findings on Mary Celeste, and I can authoritatively tell you that she is the biggest scam in history. You know, now the reason why we have held on to this lie is because we don't know our history. You know, starting from 332 BC, when Alexander III of Macedon invaded Kemet. Kemet is now what is called Egypt. Starting from that period, when the Greeks and the Romans came and ruled Africa for centuries, and much later the Arabs came, And the Arabs came and started the trans-Saharan slave trade, which lasted for over 1,000 years. And just as we're about getting over with that, came Europeans again, around the 14th, 15th century. And then we had over 250 years of slavery and much more later direct colonization and what we have now as no colonization. So our history has been interrupted. What Africans don't realize is that it was actually African people that went to Europe and civilized Europeans. For over 700 years, the African Moors ruled Europe. The first university in Europe, called the University of Salamanca, was built by African people. When you talk about Thales, you talk about Pythagoras, you talk about Julius Secundus, you talk about Aristotle. All these people were educated in Africa. They were schooled in the universities of Africa, in the universities of Quebec, in the universities of Timbuktu, in the universities of Ouagadougou in Ghana, and then they went back. The first European to have written anything called Omar was even educated in Africa. Now,
we can go on and on. The good thing is that we've been able to establish, sorry to cut you there because we're out of time, yes, apologies, but we've been able to establish something by both of you, Taopheek and Tamunokuro, that Africa is beautiful, Africa has got the talent, Africa has got the potential, and Africa needs to go back to bring in its history so that those that will especially come after us will understand the potential of this continent and see how great it is. Well, as Africa Day 2021 winds down, the continent stays close to its roots and its beauty is continuously celebrated. Hopefully the problems that come with a diverse people can be solved, as there is a need more than ever for a true African unity. Again, I thank both of you, profusely, Taopheek and Tamunokuro. It's a wrap on the show, and well, what's to come after today is celebrating the African child. Now, we're not looking at the Day of the African Child, we're talking about the Children's Day. And we have a special that will be coming here on News Central Television as we'll be speaking with African children across the world. Keep a date. I'm Sulai. Bye-bye.